Hey devs! Lately I've seen and been asked a particular question a number of times. Should I be learning Kotlin or should I be learning Flutter if I want to be a mobile developer? Now, this is a really interesting question because there's a lot of nuance to it. And so rather than just saying it depends, I want to try and capture some of those thoughts and questions that you should be considering if you're kind of wondering between these two technologies and which you should use. So like I already mentioned, the answer to this question depends. And it depends on a lot of different things. And so before we really dive into that rabbit hole of talking about all the questions, I think we should take a step back and realize that comparing Kotlin and Flutter are really comparing unlike things. It's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Kotlin is a programming language. And on its own, a programming language isn't necessarily all that useful. It's really about what you want to do with a programming language. Now, on the other hand, Flutter is pretty specific. It's a cross-platform UI toolkit that can work on a variety of platforms such as iOS, Android, and work being done for supporting the web and desktop as well. So really, when you're thinking about Flutter, it's an entire ecosystem for building cross-platform applications, whereas Kotlin is just kind of over here doing its own thing. So if you really want to compare Flutter to Kotlin, you need to do so fairly, and you need to be comparing Kotlin within the context of something else. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind as we start answering some of these more specific questions. So the first question that I want to talk through is kind of the fundamental question of why do you want to learn Kotlin or Flutter in the first place? Now, I think there's a few specific variants of this I've seen. Do you want to learn mobile development because you're just interested in it as a hobby, but you're not really planning to do anything specific with it? Are you wanting to learn Kotlin or Flutter so that you can go out and find a job within the next 3 to 6 months or a year? Or are you wanting to learn Kotlin or Flutter because you want to be your own development shop? You want to develop your own app, your own product from scratch. Maybe you have a small team, or maybe it's going to be just you. And so you're trying to understand what technology is going to best serve you in that endeavor. So let's walk through some of these questions one by one. So if you want to learn Flutter or Kotlin simply because you want to learn a bit about mobile development, then picking between them probably doesn't matter all that much. Either way, you're going to be able to build apps. You're going to start to understand what that process looks like, some of the pain points of developing for different device sizes, configurations. You'll be able to explore that with sort of any stack you choose. Keep in mind, however, that again, comparing Kotlin to Flutter directly is not quite realistic. So you'll really be looking at, Flutter plus Dart, or you might be looking at native Android plus Kotlin, or maybe native iOS plus Swift. So you'll have to take into account the entirety of the platform that you choose, but at the end of the day, it's probably not going to matter too much which one you go with. So what about if you're looking to get a job as a mobile developer? Now, this is an area where I think that right now it does matter which technology you're looking at. If you do a quick search on LinkedIn, you'll find that there are about 300-ish jobs that are mentioning Flutter right now, where there are over 3,000 jobs mentioning Kotlin. And what's more, those Kotlin jobs are likely to be spread over a little bit wider domain. You might have some mobile jobs, you could have some back-end server type jobs, because Kotlin as a language can be used in a variety of situations. The Flutter jobs are likely to be very specific to developing cross-platform mobile applications and maybe a little bit of desktop or web work in there, depending on how cutting edge the job posting is looking to be. So if you're looking to find a job in the next 3 months, 6 months, or even a year, Kotlin is probably going to be a better skill set to brush up on because it's more in demand right now, simply because it's been around longer. It's not quite as new or experimental. It has a track record at this point of being useful. It's also a lot less challenging to integrate into a team or a project, so it's a lot lower risk as well. Now, that's not to say that finding a job with Flutter isn't possible. I know people that are doing Flutter work full-time right now. It just means that that pool of available jobs is a little bit smaller. So that this could mean that you might have to be more likely to move if you find a Flutter job, or it just might mean that there's not Flutter jobs available in your area and it's just not an option. So you'll have to weigh all of that if you're thinking about choosing between Kotlin and Flutter for getting a job in the short term. If you're wanting to build an app from scratch, this is where Flutter might start to become a really good option. Now, Flutter is really designed specifically for this cross-platform development approach. So if you want to build multiple apps just on your own, or even with a very small team, Flutter is going to give you a lot of power to reuse code, reuse UI, and build your app more quickly. Now, Kotlin, or more specifically Kotlin Multiplatform, is a little bit in this area as well because it does enable you to use some code sharing, but you're still really going to be building two separate applications that are just sharing business logic. So in this case, I think Flutter makes a lot of sense and is going to be very powerful as a tool to get up and running quickly and get your product off the ground. So the next big question I want to start thinking about then is, what do you want to build? Now, I think there are a few different categories of this we can look at. So if you want to build the latest and greatest Android application with all of the coolest new features, then I think you should probably stick to native Android development and then add Kotlin into that if you want. If you're not interested in the other platforms, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to use something like Flutter and have to worry about the different development stack or learning anything about how the other platforms work. Stick to native development and use all those latest and greatest tools and features as soon as they're ready. Now, the same goes for if you want to build an awesome iOS app and use all the great iOS features. Stick with Swift and native iOS development and don't worry about the other platforms. Now, these options might be more relevant, in areas like South America or Africa or Asia where, Android is the primary operating system by a wide margin and companies might not be as interested in building an iOS app. Now, what if you want to build an app for iOS and Android at the same time? Well, like we already discussed, you have a couple options here. You could do Kotlin Multiplatform and leverage some code sharing. You could use Flutter and really build the app at the same time. The differences here are kind of subtle because with Kotlin Multiplatform, you're still building two separate native apps and just leveraging a shared library. Whereas the Flutter project is going to be a very separate app. It's going to have its own unique Flutter ecosystem using Dart. And the native approach with Kotlin Multiplatform is still going to be leveraging native iOS tools, native Android tools, as well as the Kotlin Multiplatform tooling. The risk level here is also different too, however. Flutter is much more of an all or nothing approach to get all the benefit out of it. It works best in sort of new greenfield applications where the whole thing can be done in Flutter. Whereas Kotlin Multiplatform can be integrated more piecemeal quite easily, and you can start to put shared business logic into that shared Kotlin module. So really in this case, if you're wanting to build an Android app and an iOS app, you have multiple options and you'll have to consider that on a case-by-case basis. Now, what if you want to build for platforms beyond mobile? Like we already mentioned a couple, such as desktop and web. Well, in this case, again, Flutter is maybe a little bit further ahead as there is work being done to allow you to take your Flutter project and run it on platforms beyond just iOS or Android devices. Now, the same work is kind of being done for Kotlin Multiplatform. However, it's quite early still, and there's not as many people working on it at the moment, and so it is a little bit further from being ready. So in either of these cases, it's possible. However, it's not stable in either one, and you might want to hold off on doing this for any production project quite yet. And finally, one last thing to think about is, are you going to be needing any type of back-end services for your project? Because this is an area where Flutter's not really going to help you. However, if you do know Kotlin, you can use Kotlin in conjunction with something like Ktor to build back-end services that you could then use for the rest of your project. So this is where Kotlin has a little bit of extra flexibility in the sense that you can use it not just for mobile applications, but really in the back end as well. An important aspect to this question of should you learn Kotlin or Flutter, I think, is your existing level of development experience. For example, if you're already an experienced Java developer, or really just experienced developer in general, it's going to be very easy to learn Kotlin, the language, at least enough to start being productive with it. And really the same goes for Dart if you're diving into the Flutter world. Learning a new language, once you've already learned a couple, becomes quite easy because you've already sort of trained your mind to think programmatically, which makes it a lot easier to transfer skills from one language to the next. However, if you're just starting out and you haven't really learned a first programming language yet, or you're not real confident in the little bit that you have learned, then the idea of learning a new language, I think, becomes quite challenging. And so this is where, again, the difference between Kotlin as a language versus Flutter as a whole platform becomes important. Because if you're just wanting to learn Kotlin on its own, that's a much smaller proposition than learning something like Dart and Flutter. So again here, I think really the learning curve for both of these is going to be fairly equivalent if you're starting from scratch, because you're probably going to be learning Android the platform plus Kotlin, or you're going to be learning Flutter the platform plus Dart. Now, I've heard from some people that say they think Flutter has a little bit lower of a learning curve, that it's very easy to get up and running. And the little bit I've played with that, I would tend to agree. I think it is really easy to get up and running with Flutter and start building your app. And so that makes it very sort of beginner friendly. It makes it easy to get in and start actually seeing what it's all about. So that's something right there to consider. In terms of diving in and trying to learn these things, I think there's a lot of great resources for either one. There's a great community around native Android development, Flutter development, Kotlin development, iOS as well. You have resources coming from Google, from Apple. You have community resources such as blog posts. You have weekly newsletters like Flutter Weekly, Kotlin Weekly, Android Weekly. I'm sure there's probably some type of iOS Weekly out there. So really, in this sense, I think that picking a technology in terms of how long it's going to learn is not going to be that much of an important factor. The one caveat I will add to this is if you're already sort of a native developer, so if you're already doing native iOS development and you are just wanting to stay relevant in your field, there's probably not much need to switch and pick either of these, at least within the next year or two. Same thing, if you're already a native Android developer, you don't need to switch to Flutter to stay relevant. Android is going to be relevant, I think, for at least probably another couple of years. Likewise, you don't have to start learning Kotlin to stay relevant as a native Android developer, although it will probably help as more and more shops are going to be adopting the language. However, it really doesn't take that long to pick up. So a lot of places are probably going to be willing to teach you Kotlin on the fly, or you could pick it up very quickly on the fly before an interview process. So in many ways, the amount of development experience you already have doesn't weigh too heavily into this when compared to other things like what you're trying to build and why you're trying to learn one of these new languages or platforms. Okay, so we've chatted through a number of different questions, thoughts, and concerns around this idea of choosing between Flutter or Kotlin. I've been very non-committal to any of these because, like I said, the answer really does depend on you and your situation, your project. However, if you're wanting something a little bit more specific, I can just give my rapid fire thoughts on in which cases you should pick one or the other. So here we go. If you're looking for a job right now, or let's say in the next 6 months, then I would say stick to native development. Don't worry about jumping into Flutter and learning a new ecosystem. Stick with the native tools that you already know, make sure that you're very proficient with those, and then go out and find your first job, and then worry about upskilling and staying relevant after that. If you want to build your own cross-platform application from scratch or with a very small team, then I would say go with Flutter. I think that's possibly the best cross-platform option out there right now, and the popularity behind it is growing very quickly, which makes me feel fairly confident that Google's not going to just drop this within the next year or so, by which time you'll probably have your project out the door, at least in its early state. If your team is wanting to build 2 apps at the same time, I think you should really consider both a Flutter or Kotlin multi-platform. I think either one could be viable. It's kind of comes down to a difference between, do you want to share code and stick with 2 separate native applications, or do you want to have a single application with all of the code and UI together as much as possible? And so there's trade-offs to both of those, and you'll have to consider what's best for your team and project. And so that's it. There are some of my thoughts on this idea of Kotlin versus Flutter. Hopefully this has been helpful or illuminated a few questions or thoughts for you to consider if you're looking to make this decision. I have a lot of these ideas and thoughts written down and even expanded upon in some areas in a blog post on my website. I will share the link to that down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on this comparison between Flutter and Kotlin. Thanks for watching. Until next time, devs.